morning, Bailey.
Where were you Sunday?
Why?
Sunday was Mr. Carlson's church auction.
Well, I know.
It was really embarrassing. Les, Herb, and I were the only employees who showed up.
Well, I was called away suddenly to Dayton.
Oh, come on, Les. Nobody's ever suddenly called away to Dayton.
I was visiting my mother.
Oh, well, that's nice. How is she?
Even smaller, I'm afraid.
Listen up, fellow babies. It's time for Hold My Order, Terrible Dresser, the deep dive history nerd WKRP in Cincinnati podcast. I am your co-host, Rob McDougall, and with me, as every time, is Mike Grasso. Hey, Mike.
Nice, deliberate, slow intro there, Rob. Got me in a nice, mellow mood for this episode.
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know, do we pull back the curtain? This is another rare evening episode of Hold My Order. So instead of our usual caffeinated, frenetic brilliance, we're going to, maybe it'll be a little more mellow. I don't know. We got two, I think, really good episodes to talk about this week.
I was surprised at how much I liked both of these, actually. Yeah, I didn't remember them being this fun, but I'm excited to talk about them.
I am too. We got kind of a funny pair.
Yes.
One is The Painting. It aired in January 10, 1981, followed by Daydreams, aired the next week, January 17, 1981. And what you kind of have here is, I think with The Painting we sometimes talk about high concept episodes. This is like a low concept or no concept episode, which I don't mean as a diss. That's not a dig. It's like a very solid, low-key, no guest stars, no guest sets, just the characters telling this little story that's kind of constructed like a Swiss watch, we sometimes say. Whereas Daydreams, well, it's a grab bag of half a dozen dream sequences.
Yeah.
Very different kind of style, almost like a sketch comedy sort of a thing.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But we're going to start with The Painting, and the plot is, as Les would say, simple yet complex, because basically Mr. Carlson has a church auction.
Yep.
And Herb buys a painting that he doesn't really want just to curry favor with the big guy. But Bailey does want the painting. Herb is trying to find a way to get his money back or even make a little money on the painting. And I mean, that's it.
Yeah.
It's just the ins and outs of the money changing hands and the painting changing hands back and forth in this kind of like shaggy dog tale that goes around and around and around until at the end, Herb is out $500 and the painting.
Yeah. So the value of the painting changes radically as more information is dug up about where it came from and who the artist is. And Les is also involved because, this episode also revolves around the fact that Les was not at the church auction. He was visiting Mother in Dayton, and she keeps getting smaller, Rob.
That's right. You know, we have a bit of a beef with where they take Les as the show goes on, and they maybe do a little bit too much with his mother, but just that detail on its own is a lovely, perfect little WKRP detail, I think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
How's your mother? Even smaller, I'm afraid. She's shrinking. And,
We had lunch together. You know, it's very disconcerting to have those two little eyes peering up at you from table level.
So this is a Herb-centric episode. I mean, Bailey is a big part of it, as we just said, but this episode's really, it really focuses on Herb, like so many of these season 3 episodes seem to have.
Yeah, that's right. I believe this episode is written by Steve Campman.
Yep.
And Campman and Torokvei, as we've said, kind of fell in love with Herb and made him the center of a lot of episodes. And this episode really couldn't work with anybody else.
Yeah.
It's the classic thing they always say about cons is that, you can't con an honest man, right? That sort of the mark's own greed is key to making the con work. I don't actually think that's true, by the way. I think that that's just what they say in movies about cons and books about cons and what con artists like to say. I think that honest people get snookered all the time in real life, but on TV, you can't con an honest man, and it's Herb's own greed. He's hoisted by his own petard, totally, in this episode. With an assist from Bailey. This is one of the best episodes that, just in terms of giving Bailey something to do, all the way through the episode, and so her sparring with Herb is, that's really fun.
Yeah, I mean, the episode shows how canny Bailey can be, But it also shows that her kind of sentimental, emotional side can sometimes get the better of her. Like I said, you know, she really goes to the mat for this painting aesthetically, you know?
Yeah.
We'll talk a little later about the revelation of who actually painted the painting and what that means, but like...
What'd you think of just the painting itself?
Well, I mean, it looks like a church jumble sale painting, you know?
Yeah.
It's very authentic in that regard. And the fact that, you know, Herb doesn't know a whole lot about art, right? I mean, that's obvious from the way he looks into the painting's provenance. I mean, I can use that term because I'm a museum guy, so
museum specialist.
I can say it with the sort of French pronunciation there. But yeah, I mean, he is totally clueless as to how to estimate a piece of art. And Bailey really, again, is never in it for the money. She finds it calming. It's like a summer breeze, she says. And I like this idea that Bailey is not, you know, again, she appreciates it aesthetically, but she's not immune. Maybe it's less the money and it's more wanting to get one over on Herb.
Right. Well, she succeeds in both, I think. And yeah, because her heart is pure or whatever, and her appreciation for the painting.
Because you're the most wholesome.
That's right.
What do you mean it's your painting?
Well, you gave it to me. It's mine.
When?
10 minutes ago.
Where?
Right here. You said, here, you can have it.
Bailey. You can have it as just a figure of speech. People say it all the time. It doesn't mean anything. It's like, thanks a million or so's your mother.
It's my painting, Herb. Thanks a million.
The term itself is anachronistic, but I wanted to point out that this episode has sort of some epic mansplaining. Like if you wanted to explain to someone,
one of those millennials, perhaps,
if you wanted to mansplain to someone what mansplaining is,
I prefer to call it Gen X-plaining. I think that...
touche. I see what you did there. Gen X-plaining.
Yes.
This episode would be a good one to show them because there's, at almost every turn, Herb tries to weasel out of whatever deal he just made by telling Bailey, Bailey, you can have it. It's just a figure of speech, or whatever he's just said. It's just a figure of speech, you know. Like so's your mother, and it's just some epic mansplaining.
But I mean that's another reason why I think the denouement of this episode is so satisfying. It's because Bailey wins.
Right.
I mean, she wins, and she's magnanimous in winning in victory. You know, by ripping up the check and everything. But, you know, she can hold that over Herb for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
I just don't believe you, Bailey. You come in here every morning in your freshly pressed outfits and your freshly scrubbed face, and you sit here all day, hardly speaking above a whisper, and then, when a man is vulnerable, shaken, upset, you just reach out and rip from him what is rightfully and fairly his. Bailey, I'm just so disappointed.
Herb, so is your mother.
Yeah, I mean, the crux of the episode is that when Herb finds out it might be worth some money because it came from a wealthy donor, that's when the kind of farce energy kicks into high gear, because all of a sudden he wants that painting back, and he'll pay above what he sold it to Bailey for to make even more money, and then Bailey realizes that there must be some additional value to this painting other than the purely aesthetic sentimental value. So
right, but there's a lot of moving parts because also he gets Les to chip in because Les stood him up. But then once the painting becomes valuable in his mind, he has to buy Les out for more than Les chipped in for. So, you know, and the big guy's involved, and just, you know, at the end when Herb says, "I'm out, let's see," and he pulls out his calculator to figure it out. And by that point, you'd have to have been watching pretty closely to know how much money had changed hands without a scorecard.
I mean, this thing is like a mammoth play. You know what I mean? It's like American Buffalo or something. It's really tough to watch all of the shells moving around on the 3-card Monte table, you know?
It is. It's kind of American Buffalo. It's kind of like a mammoth play in that sort of, it's like this intense back and forth over what are ultimately pretty low stakes.
Yes. Great point. Yeah. I mean, there's no Glengarry leads to be had here, you know?
There's a nice exchange where Herb gets Les to pony up money simply by staring at him and knowing that he will crack, right?
Well, that leads into our other sort of like repeating trope in this episode, which is that when Herb feels like he's losing money, he goes into full-fledged panic attack hyperventilation mode.
Yeah, bringing back the hyperventilation, which I think was introduced in Put Up or Shut Up when he's on the date with Jennifer, right?
Yep,
but they make a lot of use out of this, and Bailey gets the last word. You should really see somebody about that.
So where do we go from here, Rob? What do we talk about as far as this episode goes? As you say, it's really precise and it's very well engineered, and I don't think there's really a wasted scene in this episode.
Yeah, I think that this is kind of like a little masterclass in sitcom craft. You could almost take this episode and transfer the plot over to basically almost any other sitcom from the 60s and 70s, as long as it has one sort of scammy on the make character.
Oh, sure. I mean, I would go even further than that. This would work in the 50s. It would work in the 90s. I mean,
yeah.
You know, what's the one sort of eternal human emotion? Greed, right?
Yeah, like this could absolutely be a Seinfeld with George Costanza.
Jeez, yeah, absolutely.
But at the same time, it could probably have been
like a Honeymooners
Dick Van
episode
Dyke
or something.
Show, or a Honeymooners or something like that. Yeah, so this is just like the American sitcom, just like an archetypal sort of sitcom experience watching this episode.
Yeah, in the filing cabinet, it's like sitcom plot 12B or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't get art.
There's nothing to get.
No, it always has to be explained to me, and then I have to have someone explain the explanation.
She does a lot of abstract stuff. In fact, she's painting Kramer right now.
What for?
She sees something in him.
Well, so do I, but I wouldn't hang it on a wall.
So the MacGuffin in this episode, if you like, is...
it's a classic
it's
MacGuffin.
It's a classic
yeah,
MacGuffin.
Yeah.
The Maltese Falcon that is getting passed around here is this painting. I mean, as you said, the engine that drives all of this is the sort of mystery of art, and the mystery of art as simultaneously art and commodity, right? That the same painting might be worthless and it might be priceless depending on its provenance, as you say, and just depending on and that can change in the snap of a finger depending on who painted it and what other people think of it. And that's the engine driving all of this.
There's no better opportunity to encapsulate that idea of how do you appreciate art than the scene in Andy's office.
Yeah.
Which is great because, Bailey's very proud of the painting. She's showing it off to the guys, Andy, Venus, and Johnny. And they all kind of have different reactions to it. And the bit where Venus tries to get a better look at the painting after it's been hung on Andy's corkboard, and just kind of keeps stepping back and stepping back and stepping back. It is a precise piece of physical comedy from Tim Reed. I laughed out loud at that. I thought it was really good, even though I knew it was coming. It had been telegraphed.
Oh, sure. I mean, that joke's got to be from the 50s, if not from vaudeville.
Exactly.
Just backing up. And I actually thought that that the joke was going to be that he just like leaves and never comes back. Like you hear a Simpsons sort of footsteps slamming of a car door, car drive away kind of thing. But no, actually he does come back and say, that's nice. And great physical comedy from Tim Reed. And it was nice that he liked the painting, because I actually thought, the other guys' reactions are... Well, Johnny has a funny reaction,
It's a goof, yeah. He's like, he wants his artist to be tortured, He wants his artist to be...
Yeah.
I want to sense that the artist has come to terms with his own homosexuality, if not gone to jail for it.
That seems like it could be a crossover with your Whole Shebang podcast.
I was saying, that's very Rimbaud, Verlaine kind of, or Oscar Wilde. Yeah, absolutely.
There's also something funny, Velvet Goldmine-esque about the blocking in that scene is that as Johnny talks about this, Andy's crotch stays in the close-up the whole time, right over his shoulder.
A little bit of subliminal support for Johnny's discussion there. Herb comes in and, the guys can obviously see that Herb's on the make here. He's trying to get the painting back, and they all kind of band together to keep Herb from taking it back from Bailey.
Herb threatens to just take the painting, and Venus says, well, what about the four of us beat you into dust? Which the main thing I appreciate about that is that Venus included Bailey in the beatdown.
Yeah, I thought that was a very good touch and very Venus. He'll definitely get her involved in any eventual Herb beatdown.
Yeah.
But the revelation that the painting, it came from this rich donor to the Carlson's church, Mrs. Van Diesen.
Yeah.
So Herb's trying to find out the history of this painting. There's a great opportunity there because he calls and leaves a message, which lets the tension build and stretch out. And then he finally gets the call back from Mrs. Van Diesen. and he finds out the actual origin of the painting. And that actually is probably the best laugh line of the entire episode for me. His son painted it. He does one of them a day because he's in prison for selling Quaaludes.
For selling Quaaludes, yeah. He does one a day. Yeah, that's right.
Not that there isn't a very interesting history of jailhouse art.
Well, that's true. If this was today, maybe it could have value as outsider art or jailhouse art.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's from the Quaalude series. It was when young Van Diesen was in prison for dealing drugs. It's from his Quaalude period.
Okay, Teresa, we found this old meatloaf, right? And we're just wondering if it'd be okay if we ate it.
Yeah. See, the dilemma we faced as we drove around, is it wrong to eat garbage?
That's right, yeah. And another thing is it garbage? Just because we found it in the garbage, right? Or is it not just food that has fallen from grace?
Yeah, like is something art just because you hang it on the wall?
Hey, don't get me started on that. We'll be here all night. Hey.
So we have this, this essential question that you very aptly and accurately put, which is that, where is the value in art? Is it in the eye of the beholder? Is it in the market? This episode bounces back and forth between those two poles so quickly that we don't really have time to kind of think about the painting itself. And as I said, it's underwhelming. It's made by a guy who's probably using, cheap watercolor, sort of 8-color sets that you can get at the prison canteen,
Yeah. It's sort of like what's the guy's name? The happy painting guy.
Oh, Bob Ross. Yeah.
It's kind of like a Bob Ross.
I mean, he does one a day, right? Yeah.
Those are probably worth something.
Well, there you go, right? Like that kitsch, that sort of like Bob Ross, Thomas Kincaid. If it's somebody who's famous who does it, all of a sudden it's an actual valuable painting,
Yeah, I think that the one turn of the historical cultural wheel that separates us from 1981 is, for them, there is a clear line between art that is valuable and owned by people like the Van Giesens and kitsch.
Yes.
When Herb tells Jennifer that he's bought a painting, she's amused just at the whole idea that he would even buy a painting.
Her laughter is great. Yeah.
Her laughter is great. And she says, do I see a matador emblazoned on black velvet? And, which tells us exactly the sort of painting that Herb would own.
Herb actually think that's a pretty good painting, actually.
He would think that's a pretty good painting. But, probably somebody's selling black velvet paintings to Brooklyn hipsters today for
there you go.
For big money. I think like the line between kitsch and art has probably corroded somewhat in the intervening years.
I really liked how this episode handled the fact that to Herb, if a rich person owned it, it must be worth something. Like that's really interesting to think about, because the thing with art museums is that there is so much concentrated social kind of capital and reputation capital kind of built into historically what visual art's been all about, that you end up with an episode like this and you see how most of us look at museum art. It's sacrosanct in a way. If there are rich people involved, it's beyond reproach to question someone's taste. You know what I mean?
Well, yes, and yet also there's this sneaking suspicion on the part of everyone who isn't an art appreciator that it's all a put on, right?
Yeah.
That you can't quite figure out where the value lies. People come in and look at the painting and say, well, my kid could do that. There's like a million stories of that, of either serious paintings that big kerfuffle in Canada several years ago when Voice of Fire, this painting that's just one red stripe, was bought by the government for all this money. There's always people pulling pranks where they, either artists or just pranksters, blurring the lines between what is art exhibit, is it art just because you hang it on the wall? Don't get me started. We'll be here all night.
Right, yeah. Have you seen Exit Through the Gift Shop, the Banksy quote-unquote documentary?
I actually have not seen it.
Yeah, so it's about Banksy ostensibly taking another artist under his wing, and then that artist rebels against him and does all of these kind of like very, very sort of intentionally outre kind of misunderstood pieces of art. But by the end of the documentary, you're convinced it was all put on in a hoax by Banksy, including the movie you just watched.
Yeah.
And, Banksy's always played with those kind of things in his public art installations and everything. Everybody wants to be Andy Warhol, right? Everybody wants to have been the first person to kind of have that flash where they could say, oh, right, things that we encounter every day are art. But you know what? Once you make that statement, it doesn't really mean a lot if you make that statement again 30 years later. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yes, right. Andy Warhol did that, about a decade before this sitcom episode. And then, there's kind of an arms race of how meta you can get, or how many quotation marks you can put around something, or how you can, like sort of the levels of sincerity and sarcasm that you can build up. Which is why, even though it's a cliche thing to do, I invoke, Brooklyn hipsterdom, because I just think that, well, I was about to say that's the dialectic of our time, but I might be betraying my age. I feel like the dialectic of our time, yours and mine, Mike, was the sort of question between sarcasm and sincerity.
Oh, sure.
And the extent to which we live within quotation marks. And I don't know, the millennials seem to have...
that is not a primary concern for them philosophically or politically. Let's just say that.
Yeah. We spent a lot of time worrying about whether we, do I even like this band? Are we being sarcastic? I don't even know, man. Like that was something we spent a lot of time worrying about. And I guess they don't lose a lot of sleep over it, actually.
Well, bringing things kind of full circle, talking about the episode again, like, as I was sitting here kind of considering all of those modern artists and postmodern artists that I find kind of tedious, I started thinking about the idea of art being a con, and bringing it all the way back around to talking about, how gullible is your mark? How greedy is your mark?
Yeah.
This is not a new thing in art. I mean, if you go back all the way to Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel and working for the papacy, I mean, right there, you've got him putting images, transgressive ideas in his art and basically getting them to pay for it.
Yeah, it's
it's not a new thing,
Yeah.
And there's lots of class implications to this episode too. I mean, we talked about it already, but I think the reason why the revelation of Herb's, playing the game of telephone and telling us what Mrs. Van Giesen said is so effective, because all of a sudden you expect the son to be this like artistic savant, and then he's not just in prison for like, insider trading or something like that. He's just a scummy teenager who basically, got in trouble for dealing drugs. And it's like, oh, that brings everything back down to earth again, and brings everything back down to kind of like Herb's level. You know what I mean?
Right. Because that whole scene is shot through with class anxiety. Herb.
Oh, God, of course. Yes.
He has to put on airs just simply to make the phone call. He tells them to call, he makes a point of saying that it's Herbert Ruggles Tarlick the fourth, and then he corrects himself and says the fifth or something.
Yeah, he keeps adding. Exactly.
Adds another, like, just to make it more impressive, he adds another great grandfather behind him. And I think, is this the first time we hear his middle name?
It is. I've been wanting to talk about this. And speaking of artists who have a complicated and intriguing legacy, I really do feel like that giving him that middle name is a tribute to Thomas Pynchon. I really do.
Thomas Ruggles Pynchon.
Pynchon, yeah, exactly. I think that it could have been Hessman. It could have been, any of these other sort of like counterculture types on the writing staff or in the writer's room that kind of just figured they'd give him this little throwaway middle name that's actually also Pynchon's middle name.
That's totally possible.
I sense great vulnerability. A man-child crying out for love, an innocent orphan in the postmodern world.
I see a parasite. A sexually depraved miscreant who is seeking only to gratify his basest and most immediate urges.
His struggle is man's struggle. He lifts my spirit.
He is a loathsome, offensive brute. Yet I can't look away.
So you were talking about black velvet paintings
Yes.
as sort of the common cultural signifier of kitschy art. So you did a little research.
I did.
Where the black velvet painting comes from.
I did. I was delighted by this. So the classic kitschy art of mid to late 20th century America is the black velvet painting. Whether it's a matador or Elvis or a scary clown or maybe a nude Polynesian woman.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, so the first place I went was Wikipedia, as one does.
Sure.
And there I learned the delightful fact that black velvet paintings were introduced to Europe by Marco Polo, that they go back to.
What would modern America be without Marco Polo? There'd be no spaghetti. There'd be no, everything that he brought back from the East. My goodness.
That's right. But if I skip a few centuries in the history of black velvet, the kind of modern black velvet story I got this from a wonderful little article on something called Collectors Weekly that we can link to in the show notes.
Yeah.
It says here, what we think of as the modern tradition of velvet painting started with a scoundrel named Edward Lieteg. So there, again, sort of like the art and the con always together. And Lieteg was a sign painter who was kind of wiped out by the Depression, and he washed up in Hawaii, and he bought a whole bunch of black velveteen because it was cheap, and started working on painting. And I guess it's not actually that easy to paint on velvet. Like sort of,
I would imagine not. Yeah, it's not as accepting of the paint as canvas would be.
Exactly, but it has this kind of weirdly compelling sense because the negative space is dark, of course.
Yes.
And he was sort of a drunk and sort of a con man, and but he was also a painter, and he started painting different things, and in particular, he would paint topless Polynesian beauties. That was his muse was naked Hawaiian and Tahitian ladies, and he would trade these paintings for like sandwiches and booze and that sort of thing. And of course, his moment came when the Second World War brought hundreds, thousands of U.S. servicemen to Hawaii.
So the same impulse that brought the tiki bar back to America in the post-war period brought black velvet paintings back.
Exactly, like the tiki bar. People bringing back, so the soldiers, the sailors started buying these Polynesian beauty paintings. Another kind of eccentric character, this Navy submariner named Aloha Barney Davis, became Lieteg's dealer, basically funneling Lieteg's paintings back to the States, like to supply the burgeoning tiki bar market.
Oh, there you go.
They just started turning up everywhere. So the paintings were now selling for like thousands of dollars, and Lieteg couldn't keep up with demand, and he built a vast estate which he called Villa Velour. But then he learned he had a venereal disease in 1953, went on a drinking binge, and crashed his Harley Davidson, killing himself.
That's the complete story right there. I mean, really, what else do you need?
But there's another chapter, which is so velvet paintings by now were like a standard part of the tourism industry in Hawaii, and were associated with Hawaii until in the 1950s. The Mexicans got into the act and started selling these paintings in Tijuana and all along the border. Anytime you have a market for something, now instead of this sort of trickle, they started mass producing, and they set up these shops where like 100 people would work on these at a time, sort of churning them out. And like one person would paint, the clown's nose, and one person would paint the clown's hat, and they could just like bang them out like this.
And obviously that will take a little bit of the exoticism and the cachet away from these formerly very rare, very precious objects.
And then finally, it seems like this is a story about like American empire, like anywhere American servicemen go, black velvet paintings pop up. So like Vietnam and the Philippines, and basically anywhere you have soldiers, people start painting what they think will appeal. In Vietnam, there was this kind of crossing this with another tradition of tacky art. There was a genre of velvet paintings of U.S. soldiers as big-eyed children.
Oh, like the Keens, yeah.
Exactly like the Keens, yeah. And there's sort of this weird paintings of like these big-eyed GIs, like psychoanalyze that however you want. Sad-eyed little child GIs.
This kind of craftsmanship is almost a lost art, Jennifer. So rare to find nowadays.
And it's not immature for a grown man to have toy soldiers. This is a real hobby. Nothing to be ashamed of.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Hey, we get some good old-fashioned big guy at his desk shenanigans, which I always love to talk about. This seems to be this Mike's big guy's desk corner, but this one's special, Rob, because
it speaks to both of us, because the big guy is playing with miniatures, with toy soldiers.
I think it's a Scots regiment of some kind. He's doing a really horrible Scottish accent at the beginning of the scene, playing the bagpipes on his throat.
That's right. He does a little throat bagpipe. No, that's lovely. And Jennifer makes a point of saying, "Oh, it's not immature for a grown man to have toy soldiers. This is a real hobby."
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for legitimizing really the entire last almost half century of wargamers, D&D players. I mean, what is the big guy but a Midwestern wargamer And, in another universe, maybe the big guy got into wargaming. The local store said, hey, we got this new game. You don't play by the unit, you play by individual characters. And it's called Dungeons, and it's called Chainmail, and you should really give it a try, Art. So there's my headcanon, there's my fanfic.
Well, I mean, I'm not certain I can see the big guy going down that road. Maybe little Arthur, sad to say, might have gotten into the bloodier aspect of it. But
he is the right age for Dungeons and Dragons.
He's
That's
exactly the right age, and this is the right time and place.
I mean, we really should talk about it because not everyone's read John Peterson's Playing with the World.
That's right. Yeah. No, this is we subject near to both of our hearts. Ground zero for role playing games. Dungeons and Dragons being the granddaddy of them. It came out of miniatures wargaming, but it came out in a particular time and place, and that time and place was the Midwest, not so far from Cincinnati, and the time was, the early 70s, not so far from when this episode, 81, when this aired, is really when Dungeons and Dragons is having its moment.
Yes, it breaks out really this year and the next year. I mean, we can say that the moment that Gary Gygax went to Hollywood is when things started going downhill. Like any good VH1 behind the music, he starts, floating by the pool, and pretty soon everything was going downhill. But yeah, I mean, I think, and the types of people who were playing those war games were people like the big guy, veterans, hobbyists who really liked the history of war. It is a legitimate hobby, Jennifer's right, and it's from this milieu that Dungeons and Dragons and the colossal cultural movement that it's become, it all comes out of these 3-piece suit wearing bald middle-aged guys in basements playing with their toy soldiers.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think, and you have heard me and read me on this subject before, that I think that the power of Dungeons and Dragons was that it synthesized that world with a kind of Tolkien, hippie creativity, free-flowing fantasy, magic, elves, the Hobbit leaf sort of thing. And it's those two things coming together, the suits and the dungarees coming together, that created this phenomenon in the 70s. It's hard to picture how, could there have been a WKRP episode that somehow related to Dungeons and Dragons, that somehow had Dungeons and Dragons in it? Like, I just don't think that...
Well, by season 4, I think Mazes and Monsters had been on TV with Tom Hanks. That's 82, right? So it was definitely, and the steam tunnel thing.
Oh, absolutely. It's just hard to see how exactly it would get into the world of the show.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Unless it was through someone like
little Arthur
Jr., which I don't know if I would, would I be willing to take another Arthur Jr. episode if it meant there was a D&D episode of WKRP? That's when I got to ponder.
Boy, that's an eternal question. I'm going to be thinking about that for weeks. Jeez.
Hey, big guy, 2 questions. 1, why is Jerry Lewis so popular in France? Ha! Just kidding. And 2, how much did the auction take in?
Another thing that's well worn in the culture at this point, there's a recurring reference to the Jerry Lewis telethon and Jerry's Kids.
That's right. Herb won't even give to Jerry's Kids. Unless he's a little confused about why Jerry's Kids need money. This is, of course, a reference to the extremely long running. I think it's just ended in the last few years. Extremely long running Jerry Lewis telethon, which used to happen every year on like Labor Day, I want to say.
Labor Day weekend
for muscular dystrophy.
Mm-hmm. And so many classic pop culture references. I mean, you would, if you didn't know about Jerry Lewis and you watched the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, you would be completely lost. Because every season there's at least 2 Jerry Lewis references. Of course, there's Professor Frink, who is himself a Jerry Lewis reference. But yeah. And Herb makes a they love Jerry Lewis in France joke.
Yeah.
And that kind of surprised me because I didn't think that trope had taken root in the culture this early, but apparently it was a well-worn. I mean, I guess he had already shot The Day the Clown Cried at this point and stowed away the negatives forever, never to be seen. But
that's right. They just surfaced, right? Did you see?
Yeah, they just did.
Yeah.
I know.
I don't have anything else to say about that.
That's the black velvet paintings of cinema in the 20th century, basically.
Of cinema, Jerry Lewis's lost Holocaust comedy. Yeah.
Oh, Jesus. But I guess Jerry Lewis had been appreciated in France since his movies first came out in the late 50s and early 60s, because I guess to the French, and, we're going to try to explain this as best we can, getting within sort of this alien cultural mindset, but to the French, he's an heir to all of these classic silent clowns, basically, like this idea of, oh God, all I can think about is that Kids in the Hall sketch with,
Monsieur Piedlord? My French pronunciation is terrible, but yeah, Mr. Heavyfoot. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like the French love silly physical comedy. Like,
well, I think we're back to this question of kitsch and art, actually.
Oh God,
and
yeah, totally.
You step out of the culture and you see these things differently. And clowns, clowns are another favorite subject of the Black Velvet paintings. Like clowns are kitschy, but Europeans have a slightly different relationship to clowns and harlequins and this sort of thing. And they have this, Jerry Lewis. He was always popular in America, but he got this kind of high cultural respect in France that is funny to Americans because he doesn't get that sort of respect in America. And I like Herb's delivery when he comes in and says, 2 questions, big guy. Number 1. And then he laughs at his own joke.
Did you see that book I linked to in the notes about the literal title of it is Why the French Love Jerry Lewis, and it's an academic Stanford University Press book about the history of cabaret and early silent comedy cinema and Jacques Tati and
wow, they go way back. Yeah, well, trust an academic, speaking as one, to if you want to get to the bottom of a question like why do the French, well, that's Herb's question, right? Why do the French love Jerry Lewis? So here's the answer, Herb. You should read Why the French Love Jerry Lewis by Ray Beth Gordon. Let me see. It comes from, as you said, Stanford University Press, and it goes right back to, cabaret and early French film comedy.
I guess the thesis of the book is that basically the French love a nervous wreck, essentially. And that kind of makes sense because when you think about the French cultural character, it's this very smooth, sort of unflappable, right? Nothing bothers me. But to introduce a neurotic, sort of twitchy person who's gonna, the schlemiel, as Ron Swanson said in that episode of Parks and Rec, introduce someone like that into, what the cultural imperative is to be very French and very cool. I think that makes kind of makes sense, I think.
Yeah, this is neat. I'm just reading this for the first time, but this extraordinary emphasis in Parisian cafe concerts on nervous pathology, the genres of the epileptic singer and the idiot comic, traced back to the late 19th century. I might have to read this.
I know, it sounds really interesting.
Yeah. So, Herb, you asked more than you knew.
Tonight, Mr. Carlson has the honor of delivering the keynote address at the annual Ohio Broadcasters Dinner.
Oh, God.
Since none of you people are nice enough to have been invited to that function, I have asked Mr. Carlson to preview that little talk for us, and he has graciously agreed. So, ladies and gentlemen, the incredible Art Carlson.
Come on. Thank you.
All right, our next episode is titled Daydreams, and its setup begins with the big guy having to give a big speech at the annual Ohio Broadcasters Dinner, and he's a little nervous. And the first thing I thought when Jennifer was trying to kind of help calm him down is, I would imagine the big guy's had to do a lot of speeches in his life, but I think there's a reference there when Jennifer says, she knows that the big guy's nervous. She knows how he's nervous. So maybe he goes through this every single time he has to make a speech.
That would make sense. Yeah, I'm sure he's given talks before. Was he a Toastmaster, or that was Les?
That was Les, but he's a member of the Kiwanis, obviously.
He's a Kiwanis, he's a Rotarian. Yeah. He drives a Dodge. He's given plenty of speeches.
So the big guy's nervous, and the speech is tonight. And so everyone in the main cast, is brought together in the bullpen to listen to the big guy's speech, but none of them can seem to pay attention to the speech, not even Jennifer for that matter. And all of them sort of fade away into these lovely little daydream sequences that take up basically 90% of this episode.
That's right. I think we have one for each character, which means we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 dreams.
Herb, Jennifer, Les, Bailey, Andy, Venus, and Johnny all have daydreams.
Right. The conceit of the episode means, unfortunately, we don't get to see Arthur dream sequence, which would be lovely. Yeah. So we get dream sequences, and that is the episode, which means that the episode is very choppy, very episodic, if you like. It's almost more like a collection of sketches.
Yes.
Campman wrote the episode we just talked about. Tarakve has screen credit for this one. Both Campman and PJ Tarakve had SCTV backgrounds.
Yeah.
And this episode almost feels like a bunch of SCTV sketches, don't you think?
It really does, especially considering how grounded each of them is in a particular, very familiar cultural milieu. Like if you see Herb's sequence or Venus's, and you just see a picture of what the sequence looks like, you're going to know exactly what the setting is, what's going on. They're very easy to kind of convey.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what did you think of this episode, Rob?
I mean, there's certainly things that I thought were funny. And I guess I remember as a kid, this is an episode I remember, and I remember really liking. And I think that...
Is this like the That's Entertainment thing that you were talking
about?
about?
It's like a clip show. I love clip shows. I love clip shows, but...
clip shows from the golden age of Hollywood, basically.
Which there's a lot of those in this. This is basically a clip show, a reference show. But yeah, I think that, I always love this sort of thing. People think of like dream sequences as hacky, but I always kind of loved sitcom dream sequences. I loved episodes where they riff on A Christmas Carol or It's a Wonderful Life. I loved Rashomon episodes. I love episodes that sort of, that take the characters, put them into another place, into another setting. And, so much of modern comedy of like today, or at least, since the 90s into the 21st century, kind of like reference comedy is so common where it's just like we make a joke and it's become kind of hollow. Like this is the everyone's knock against Family Guy is that they aren't even really making jokes. They're just sort of like, here's the thing that reminds you of some other thing that you've seen.
Yes.
That's kind of what this episode is doing. But I feel like there was less of that in the 70s and 80s. It was less common. And so this just seemed to me as a kid, maybe, there might be some precursor that I'm not thinking of, but it seemed to me really kind of weird and cool and different. And I just wanted to see I want to see the alternate history Johnny and the alternate history Venus and all these things.
When you're talking about sort of like the idea of making references and pop culture references, I think before The Simpsons, they had to happen in scenarios like this episode. They had to happen in explicit dream sequences, fantasies, those kind of things.
Yes.
I think the Simpsons kind of opened up the idea that you could drop a blatant pop culture reference right into the plot because it was a cartoon, so you have a little bit more flexibility with the landscape. But that even started to kind of infiltrate into, non-animated comedies in the aughts, like Arrested Development. There's no way in reality that many callbacks and references could happen to real people, but The Simpsons kind of freed everybody to be able to do that kind of thing in a traditional sitcom manner. And I think that, this kind of episode happened. I think there was like a Cosby Show where there was a fantasy sequence. It's not uncommon to see this in sitcoms before The Simpsons. I think since The Simpsons has happened, you see less of them. And I think that's because of that change in how comedy works on TV.
Yeah, and you're so right about sort of at this time, they had to do so much setup to get to allow so much setup in order to justify the cutting away in a way where The Simpsons, Arrested Development, Family Guy, of course, just smash cuts to the thing and smash cuts back again, and nobody thinks about it. But
you're in reference to sort of talking about The Simpsons being a reference-laden thing. It created a different kind of narrative that kind of superseded this old type.
Yeah. There's, narratives have, I often think of them as like technologies. They're sort of like narrative technologies. And if you put somebody if you took someone, from the 1950s and sat them down in front of The Simpsons, like, could they deal with it, And there's
that's a great question. Wow, the culture shock, the future shock of The Simpsons.
Yeah.
To somebody from the 50s, that's amazing.
Just the narrative structures. Like, think about how many TV shows, well into the 70s, think of how many TV shows the theme song explained the premise.
Right, yeah. We actually are deeply engaged in one of those shows ourselves.
Yeah.
And a new day will dawn for those who stand long, and the forests will echo with laughter. Does anybody remember laughter?
The one thing that I can't help but think about when I watch this episode, maybe it's just the Andy sequence, which we've kind of previewed as a Godfather sequence, but this episode just reminds me so much of, You've obviously have watched as a midnight movie or otherwise Led Zeppelin's famous concert/fantasy sequence film, The Song Remains the Same, right?
yeah, right.
I mean,
right.
everybody gets to live out their fantasy. Robert Plant is a Celtic warrior, and John Paul Jones is a Dr. Sin type highwayman, and Peter Grant's the manager. His fantasy of being a gangster who breaks people's legs is really not that different from what he was like in real life.
His fantasy, right? Something you see the limits of both the extent and the limits of people's imaginations. Well, it's sort of funny that the guys in Led Zeppelin, I mean, being
a rock star, right?
Yeah, being in Led Zeppelin is a lot of people's fantasy. It's sort of like, like they already are living an archetypal fantasy. I wonder if it was like, whose idea was that movie? Did some director pitch it to them like, Robert, you're going to get to be this Celtic warrior, or like, did they come up with this because this was like what they wanted?
Well, I mean, it was the height of their sort of decadent period, right? I mean, this is like 75, 76. So like, at this point, they've done everything. They've toured, what did the Spinal Tap say? The world and elsewhere, right? They've toured everywhere. And like, I feel like this was another one of those like Peter Grant driven sort of like, let's make some more money off of like some old concert footage. Because if you remember the concert footage in Song Remains the Same is not great.
Yeah.
The performance, I think Robert Plant's vocals are not fantastic. And you watch it for the cheese factor of those fantasy sequences.
Yeah, definitely.
Radio. What is it? Where did it come from? And where is it going? Oh, no. Who would have thought?
So, number one.
Well, the first thing we should do is we should say that the big guy's speech is about the history of radio.
Yes.
So every time we cut away from a dream sequence, we have another element to the history of radio that introduces that dream sequence.
And, I am a media historian, but I thought the big guy speech was pretty good.
It's a great history of radio. I just did an exhibit on the history of radio.
Yeah.
The big guy could have curated our exhibit. No problem.
Yeah.
I mean, he knows, radio. What is it? Where did it come from? Where is it going? These are the questions you want somebody to ask at the beginning of their of their talk on the history of radio. But he starts off by saying, radio is an important part of like political infrastructure, and when a revolution happens, the rebels always go for the radio station first, which is very historically accurate.
Yes, and that takes us to Herb's dream. Herb is the first one to nod off, and he imagines himself as the dictator of some war-torn, revolution-torn kind of banana republic.
Yeah.
And he is dining al fresco with Jennifer. I don't know what her character name is, but with this beautiful woman that's Jennifer, as there's talk of revolution in the air, and Frank Bonner gets to do this kind of over-the-top Spanish accent.
Yeah, you say over the top. I don't think it was over the top enough, to be honest with you. It just sounded like Frank Bonner occasionally trying to roll an R or two.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. It's never specified where he is or what. It's just sort of generic Banana Republic stan, right?
Yes. Yeah. White military uniform, epaulets, and
I thought of. Did you read Tintin? I thought of like General Alcazar and General Tapioca.
I don't have that Tintin history.
Oh, okay. Alcazar was more of like the people's hero. He was like Castro, but Herb looks exactly like General Tapioca, who is Alcazar's nemesis.
I mean, here's the thing about this dream sequence, Rob, is that like in this dream sequence, things are not going well for Franco Tarlik here. I mean, they are. He is under siege, literally and figuratively. I mean, the Pope won't even grant him a divorce, for God's sake.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you said, are these wish fulfillment? I feel like many of these start out as wish fulfillment and then things go wrong.
Well, it is kind of like that. I don't know if you've watched Red Dwarf at all, but there's a great episode where they go into a kind of a virtual reality environment, and Rimmer, the one character who kind of hates himself, ends up creating this hell for himself. First he hooks up with the woman he's always wanted to, but then they turn around and he's got 6 children and a mortgage. And I think it's one of these things where, Herb can't help but fantasize about things going wrong in his fantastical sort of tin pot dictator mode. There's a clue in what he says to the Jennifer character where he says, a leader is a father to the people. The people are my children. I am their father.
Yeah.
And this is all of Herb's masculine anxiety laid bare for us.
Yeah.
And he thinks, he thinks he's the head of a household and he thinks he's got his business down, but nothing's in his control. And I think that's really interesting.
Sure. And he can't rid himself of his family. He wants to, possess the beautiful woman, but he can't leave his wife. That's Herb Tarlek's psychology right there on display.
Yeah, absolutely.
I knew you'd come.
Jennifer, my darling, I didn't want to disturb you, to burden you with my petty needs, but try as I might, there's no way I could stay away from you.
Sit down, Carrie. There's no one I'd rather lounge around the house with than you.
So the next dream sequence, we move pretty quickly into, now Mr. Carlson's speech has moved into the 1930s, and he just makes a passing reference to 1930s movie stars.
Yeah.
And we fade into Jennifer's dream sequence. This is sketched very lightly, but basically Jennifer is lounging on a luxurious white bed, and she's a kind of a 1930s movie
Jean Harlow kind of
bombshell and she's talking to, well, we don't see him, but his voice is recognizable to anybody who's 55 years old or older.
What was that line the big guy says? You'd have to be pretty old to remember this.
Says, if anyone here can remember those times, you're probably quite old. That's right. But anyway, the voice is the very distinctive voice of Cary Grant, the movie star Cary Grant, at least at first.
You put something great in the notes about how this is the only dream sequence we see from like a first person, kind of from someone who's not the dreamer, basically.
Yeah, it's a little bit weird that the dream is shot from with a kind of subjective point of view shot from Cary Grant's point of view, right up to, we even see his hand in the frame with a cigarette, like almost like the gun in a first person shooter, this sort of like a first person smoker, or like the old SNL sketch about with the video date where you get to pretend that you're on the date. Of course that the reason for that is that so that they don't have to show Cary Grant, who's not actually guest starring in the episode, and it leads to a joke reveal when it's not Cary Grant but Les who is there, and he has a very memorable line which confused me as a kid, but nevertheless I remember it.
I was wondering if you could pour something sticky all over me.
You could tell Richard Sanders loved being able to say that line. I mean,
I know it's just a decision to, not show Cary Grant's face, but it seems symptomatic of something that even in her own daydream, Jennifer is like the target of the male gaze, right? And it maybe speaks to like the show's inability to get into her head. That like,
wow, yeah.
Like what does Jennifer fantasize about?
Her life is already like a perfect, she's got everything. She's got all the attention she would ever want. She's got all the money and hot doggers and popcorn poppers she could ever want. So what does Jennifer Marlowe fantasize about?
That's right. What does Jennifer Marlowe fantasize about? And we really don't know. Yeah, okay, Cary Grant, sure. I mean, you can't get much more sort of like hunky, classic, old-time movie star than Cary Grant.
Yes.
Cary Grant once famously said, everybody wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant. And, I think one of the interesting things about Cary Grant is the sort of mystery of his sexuality, actually.
Oh, sure,
He's sort of playful with it in a way. So, yeah, if Jennifer's going to fall for an old-time matinee idol, Cary Grant is a good one. But I still feel like I would have asked them to go back to the drawing board and think a little harder about what Jennifer fantasizes about.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways it could have gone. They could have gone the rock throw route. They could have made her into like a country star or something like that, like a Dolly Parton.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this wouldn't be her fantasy, but sure, wouldn't it have been cool to see Jennifer back in her rock throw days or something?
One thing I find interesting, though, is that Cary Grant himself would have been the age that a lot of Jennifer's paramours are.
That's right.
He would have been in his 70s at this point, so...
That's true. So she's not necessarily fantasizing about the 1930s Cary Grant.
It might be.
I mean, he had a long career. He got his start in in movies in the 30s.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he was in vaudeville or something
Yes.
like that. But he,
Yeah.
he was in movies in the 30s, right into, he was still a sex symbol in the Kennedy years. In the
North by Northwest.
North
Yeah.
by Northwest, yeah. In the early 60s, I think by the 70s, no, he's retired.
Yeah.
But yeah, he'd be Jennifer's vintage by that
I
point.
know, yeah, exactly. It'd be the age of the Admiral, right?
Don't forget, Toots. At least we'll always have Paris.
I've never been to Paris.
I know. What I mean is, Paris will always be there.
I see.
So I want to get to the next one, which I think is my favorite and has been since I was a kid, even though maybe, again, I didn't get every single reference in Les's fantasy sequence, which the big guy gets into World War II and Edward R. Murrow. And I loved the look. I mean, Richard Sanders really, really delivers this when he goes, he's my hero.
Yeah, he's excited that the speech, he's actually into the speech.
Yes.
He's excited that now we've gotten up to World War II and to Edward R. Murrow, the great, wartime correspondent, wartime radio journalist in London during the Blitz, reporting on the war for Americans. And so we go into Les's fantasy, and he's not Murrow, he's Les.
Yes.
But he's in the role of Edward R. Murrow.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. Not even in his fantasy can Les give up his own delusions of grandeur, that he is the sine qua non newsman. And yeah, he has some great, again, kind of like, 1940s appropriate, film appropriate banter with a driver played by Jan Smithers, kind of as Bailey, I guess, as an army driver. And boy, what do you have to say about this scene? Maybe on reflection, watching it as an adult, it does fall a little flat as far as there being any kind of sparks or any kind of excitement, but man, Richard Sanders knows how to do a 1940s radio voice really well.
Yeah. I think that, like the sequence goes on for a while, and it's not chock full of jokes. It's not even like clear that it's going anywhere. It just sort of, they're just obviously enjoying recreating that vibe.
Yes.
And it's not just an Edward R. Murrow thing. It's sort of a general World War II era pastiche.
Yes.
It sort of bleeds out into just kind of more generic references to different World War II movies, in particular Casablanca.
Yes.
As time goes by, starts playing, and Bailey has a line about the troubles of two people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy mixed up world.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of,
well, it's what you said earlier. This is how you got to reference it.
Yeah.
Back in the 1970s and 80s, you kind of had to have dream sequence, and you could stuff all the different references that you wanted to into the script.
Yeah, that's right. Les also, in his daydream, even though it's World War II, he's prescient enough to say that even once Hitler is defeated, the Russian bear is next. Don't forget I said that, he says.
Now, I know he's 5 years ahead of what George Patton said. Remember, Patton wanted to go all the way across Germany and right up to Moscow, right? He's saying it in 1940 before the Americans were even in the war. So Les is more macho than George S. Patton.
That's right. But the scene does, there's this interplay with Bailey, and then she leaves, and then he keeps talking. It goes on for a while more. Oh, and then it becomes like a Tom Joad thing, right? Then he says, "Wherever this is happening, you will find me. Wherever this is happening, I'll be there."
Well, I think that's great though, because that ties in the whole Greatest Generation with the New Deal generation kind of thing. It's like, this war is about injustice. This war is about, you know what I mean? It really, it speaks to the time really well.
And then I think they just didn't have any way to get out of it, so they drop a bomb on him. That's it.
Oh, God.
I just don't think this reception is going to go well tomorrow. Here's your tea, darling. I swear, I think the last tenants took half the silver with them. I've got 500 guests invited.
Well, don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it? Oh, great. It's followed by a sit-down dinner for 500. Don't worry about it. I am doing my best to keep the social calendar together, and I just don't feel like you're giving me any help at all. Are you even listening to me?
So speaking of Bailey.
Yeah.
Well, this particular dream sequence has a little bit of a story behind it, because for years and years in syndication, people did not see the Bailey sequence.
That's right. I do not remember seeing this. They had to shorten this episode for time, and wouldn't you know it, whose fantasy, whose dream gets cut out but Bailey just doesn't get any respect. If you were the person that had to cut 3 minutes out of this episode, do you think they made the right choice?
Well, I mean, Jennifer's sequence isn't 3 minutes long, so I would obviously leave that one on the cutting room floor, but I think the reason why Bailey got cut isn't just because it's Bailey. I think it has a lot to do with the content of the dream sequence.
Maybe so, yeah. So the sequence opens innocuously enough with Bailey and Johnny in bed together.
Wearing matching jammies.
And they're not being amorous. They appear quite clearly to be a married couple, but Bailey is working. She's wearing those half glasses, and she's working away. She's got pigtails, which, speaking of the male gaze,
oh no,
she's looking fine. That's all I'm saying.
Sure,
she's looking great.
She is wearing the hell out of those very unisex blue pajamas.
That's right. And Johnny is stressing about this big dinner he's got to throw. And it's kind of a slow reveal that Bailey is, in fact, the president of the United States.
Oh, so timely, huh? I mean...
A woman president.
Who'd have thought?
Woman president. Think of it.
I know, it's almost impossible to conceive of. And it's almost... I think that's one of the reasons, like I said, Rob, I think that's one of the reasons why the sequence got cut. So in the days leading up to the Democratic National Convention, I read an article about a T-shirt that was banned from Walmart in 1995 because it went against Walmart's and family values. Now, 1995 family values, what do you think about? You think about maybe like violent rap lyrics or, Sex in the Media? No, it was Margaret from Dennis the Menace saying one day there's going to be a woman president. And that was 1995.
1995. That was against family values.
Yes.
Saying that someday... Boy, oh boy.
Yeah.
That someday this glass ceiling would be broken. 1995, and
It's Walmart, granted.
Yeah.
But
Hillary was in the White House in 1995.
That's true. That's true.
And getting hell for simply not wanting to bake cookies.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, I think that, again, if you're going to get rid of 3 minutes, I'm not saying that every syndicator and every syndication package was like, muhaha, I'm going to be an evil man and cut out this 3 minutes that shows Bailey as the president. But if one had to go, which one would they choose? And I think that's a legitimate thing to ask.
I guess you're right. I mean, I think that this one is in many ways like...
I mean, it's not a laugh riot.
It's not hilarious, but it's the most interesting because it takes us into the future and it reveals so much more about Bailey. Like we know it was easy to guess what Les's fantasy that's not a surprise.
Sure.
But like Bailey's going to be president. That's awesome.
Yes,
that's awesome, Bailey, that you're going to be president.
I do like the idea because all of a sudden Johnny becomes like the Onion's Joe Biden, basically. Like he's hanging around the White House. He's trying to invite friends over. You can picture like, those photoshops they have of Biden with a couple of guys in like jorts and like, hanging out, washing his Camaro or whatever. Like Johnny's feeling a little bit left out of all of this important stuff that Bailey's doing and has to organize the state dinners and, only is able to have his friends over on the weekends and stuff like that.
It's true. It's a little bit, again, I'm struck by the relentlessly male point of view of this show. That, that at least, it's cool that unlike Jennifer, Bailey's fantasy is one of power and agency, that she gets to be the president. But the bit is not really about Bailey being president at all. It's about Johnny's travails as the first spouse. He's stressing about the state dinners. He feels neglected. He
whoever the previous tenant was took the silverware. Maybe that's supposed to be a Reagan reference. I don't know.
Right. I think Reagan would walk off with the silverware. Sure, it could be. He tries to get a kiss out of her, but she's too busy even for that. And it's all cute and funny. But that's that's the stereotypical classic question, right? Freud didn't know what women wanted, right? What do women want? And well, I was about to say, I don't know whether to bring in Turokve here, but
well, that's it. That's worth talking about. I mean, we've talked about PJ Turokve before and her transitioning and being transgender. Hey, it's worth thinking about and talking about. We have two very interesting portraits of femininity in this episode in Jennifer's dream sequence and Bailey's. I mean, it's the essential Jennifer Bailey dichotomy in a way, but it's interesting where each of their fantasies take them.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes, it is interesting where each of their fantasies take them. But what I'm saying is that in each case, we can't quite escape the sense that this is men looking at them and seeing their fantasies.
Yes.
We're still seeing this through a male point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it also makes me wonder, in Bailey's future, are pigtails like a presidential hairstyle? Like,
it's adorable.
Don't go away, kids. The President of the United States wants to speak to you.
I wonder what he'll have to say.
Huh? Can you hear me?
No. Put the president on, not his wife.
Present for you from the people of the United States.
All right, so next up is Andy Il Patrone.
Yeah, that's right.
You know what? I actually like this one, Rob.
Yeah.
It's fairly slight, and as you say in the notes here, it's the only one that really takes place in WKRP, right? It's like,
I like it because of that. I think that's good.
Yeah, but
yeah,
Andy is.
Yeah, you go ahead and say.
Oh, what are you saying? I should talk about this because I'm Italian American? Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, Andy's not Italian American.
No, he's not.
I did have that thought that he's a long way from being the Godfather, but then the Godfather was universal at this point.
Yeah.
Like, everybody got this reference.
It is. It's the, and again, this is like, anything from Marlon Brando redoing the role in The Freshman to Godfather references on The Simpsons. Again, like this is just something even 8 years after it came out in theaters, people just knew this reference right off the top. And I think it does something else interesting. Leah Beale, friend of the podcast, just talked to us about how Gary Sandy played a lot of like soap opera heavies before he got the Andy Travis role. And
yeah.
I actually think Andy actually projects a little bit of menace in this scene. I mean, he has to play Marlon Brando and he has to do the stereotypical Brando mannerisms, which he does a good job with. But he also, the lighting in this scene is as
Yes.
close to Coppola as they could do with like
Nicely done.
MTM budgets. You know what I mean? And it's not bad. Herb comes as like the supplicant to the Godfather asking for a favor. And I love that Johnny ends up being the one who gets the kiss of death in this one because again, he won't play the playlist. Venus is his right-hand man, his consigliere, if you will.
His consigliere,
yes.
yeah.
And Johnny has to play the playlist, but he's not going to. And he comes in all goofy like Johnny Fontaine in Godfather 1 and then Andy just gives him the kiss of death,
which is not explained. This goes to show how saturated, like how they could just expect that everybody would get that reference because all he does is kiss him.
Yeah,
and Johnny's demeanor totally changes. And
is this like that? Is it like the Fat Tony episode? The kiss of death. That's all I need.
I saw the movie Zootopia with my kids recently, and the little bunny cop and the little fox con artist at some point get hauled in front of he's like a mouse or a rat or something, but he's the Godfather, and it's a complete Godfather reference. And my kids don't get that reference, and then they're like, "Who is this guy? Why does he talk like that? What's that music mean? Why does he have that raspy voice? Like, is he a good guy or a bad guy? Why is he seems to be nice?" So eventually these things do start to fade. Although there will probably come a day when everybody knows the reference, but doesn't necessarily know where it comes
from. Yeah. Well, that's like watching old Looney Tunes cartoons from the 40s. I don't understand what a Peter Lorre reference is when I'm 8 years old in 1983, but hey, it seems to be funny and Bugs seems to be having a good time with it, so might as well laugh at it,
Hey, honey, keep walking like that, huh? Hey, Andy, how you doing? Johnny, it's so nice of you to come. Hey, I guess you know why you're here, huh? Well, I think because Venus asked me to come. Or a question of my being concerned for your welfare. Oh, I'm okay. It's a question of, how shall I say, respect. Not just for me, but for the organization.
I've never been good in large groups, you know that.
Johnny. Hey, I got a problem here. I'm asking for your help.
What problem? I mean, we're family, huh?
That's true. But that shouldn't keep you from playing the playlist. You see, I'm asking you to play the top 10 hits.
Venus is... Well, okay, let's set it up first because it's interesting. He's a hacky stand-up comic.
Yeah, that's right. He's it's not really clear where he is because they do this one with Great Economy. All we see
it's Tim Reed and a curtain and a spotlight, basically.
Tim Reed in front of a spangly gold curtain doing a stand-up routine.
Yeah,
it's not immediately clear whether he's like on Carson on TV,
right,
or whether he's like I thought that he was probably like a Vegas stand-up comic.
Yeah.
He makes some sort of Vegas-y references. He says hi to Frankie and Sammy in the audience.
Yeah. And they're watching real carefully because if he says anything bad about them after the show, he might get a visit from Frank and his thugs.
Yeah, exactly. But Tim Reed, I think, is having a lot of fun with this. It's really cool.
Yes.
Of course, Tim Reed was a stand-up comic, so it's a nice callback to his.
It is
to his origins. But there's sort of this meta comedy because he doesn't actually tell any jokes.
No, it's all it's all hacky, like intro lines that a hacky stand-up comedian would use, like, how about that weather? How about that LA? How about that solar system?
He says, hey, what about that solar system? Yeah, it's like, he's like, Vegas, tell me about it. Ooh, crazy, huh? And airports, boy, oh boy, And so it's just a sort
the fact that could be recognized by this audience as meta comedy in a way is interesting to me. It's like, and the fact that he gets heckled for it and cannot handle the heckler at all is also really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like a Beckett play, and he's kind of like trapped in stand-up hell, basically,
I do think it's a good reveal that they don't even have to show him that the heckler is Johnny, and he just looks out in the audience and, Fever, is that you?
That would be exactly where Johnny would land in Venus's fantasy. Yeah, it's like the heckler in the audience. It lays bare Venus's kind of like middle of the road conservative, kind of like maybe he's like a fan of all of these hacky Vegas comics. You know what I mean? Like it betrays his sort of like not actually that down with like, I mean, this is not Red Fox. This is not, Richard Pryor. This is corny Borscht Belt level type shtick. So
I get it because I did have that thought of like, wouldn't Venus be cooler? But
he's not.
Deep down, he's not. That his hipness is to some extent a put on, and so in his own head, he's like, he wants to be what
Buddy Hackett or
Henny Youngman sort of thing. Yeah.
Hey, what about this town, huh? I was in a casino last night. Was that place crazy or what? Now, what about that Iran stuff? Is that a country or a joke? Thank you very much. And what about those airports? Are they something? Hey, how many of you folks out there married? Come on. Do I have to say any more? Thank you, Richard.
That's not funny!
What was that?
You stink!
That's my cologne, OD motorcycle.
Well, the last one is probably the one with the least amount of, like, let's say, actual plot in it, but it's more like a vignette, really.
They're kind of rushing by this point, right?
That's a good point. That could actually be it.
I think they've just run out of time. They do a nice job in the costuming of this one.
Oh, my God. So Johnny is a rock star.
Johnny is a rock star.
Like, he's not the DJ. He's the guy on the record cover.
And all that happens is he gets out of his limo and walks into the show. That's it.
We got to go down to the lobby and wait for the limo.
That's right. But they have a lot of fun just piling on the 1980 rock star.
Oh, it's so great, isn't it? Like, Venus is his, quote, Jamaican doctor who's got the stuff he needs.
Yes, right. And Venus has the Rick James dreads with the little white balls on the end. And
Jennifer's outfit is fantastic. It's like something out of like some horrible kitsch late 70s nightmare like Phantom of the Paradise or The Apple. Like,
right. She's a
limo driver in white
the
satin.
Sexy limo driver in white satin. Exactly. And then you don't even recognize everybody else right away.
Oh my God, it was great.
Bailey just appears to be sort of a fan, maybe a schoolgirl or someone like that fan.
Yeah.
Herb is some kind of promoter or something like that.
Did you see his gold star of David around?
I did not. You spotted it. I mean, I don't know what they're trying to say there, but Herb is
after Gonzer. I think anything's up for grabs with this writing staff as far as that kind of stuff is concerned.
And then the one who is almost unrecognizable, but it's the last person who has to be there, is just kind of behind him, pushing people out of the way and sort of shepherding Johnny in is Andy, and Andy's got the best transformation. He's wearing these big 80s glasses.
Yeah.
And I don't know, his
Mustache.
hair looks like he's got like a comb over or something like
Yeah.
that. And it just like, it's this character who's so associated with his hair. He looks like he looks terrific. He looks like
he's the frazzled manager, basically, right?
Yeah, right.
And Andy is always funnier when he loses his cool, so that makes a lot of sense. He's trying to get him backstage and get him on stage for the show. Yeah.
And then Johnny's look is sort of, he's got like kind of a perm and then a dog collar and
spandex, yeah,
a leather jacket, I think, and
very David Lee Roth 81 kind of look.
That's right. He's not imagining himself as. You got to think that Johnny's favorite bands are going back a few years, right? But
yes.
But no, he's dreaming himself as a current day 1981 rock star.
Maybe this is Johnny's hell. Maybe the idea of him being David Lee Roth, like all these albums he's got to play on that are on the playlist. Maybe this is like another self-loathing fantasy from these people.
Well, and like all the other fantasies, or like most of them, there's a twist in the tale, because as he's heading towards the stage, you hear the announcer say, "Give it up, ladies and gentlemen, for the incredible Art Carlson."
And then we fade right out into the applause at the end of the big guy's speech. It's really well done, yeah.
But remember this, Harry. This mirror gives us neither knowledge or truth. Men have wasted away in front of it, even gone mad. That is why tomorrow it will be moved to a new home. And I must ask you not to go looking for it again. It does not do to dwell on dreams, Harry, and forget to live.
You said at the beginning of us talking about this episode, Rob, that one of the bad things about this format is that since the big guy is giving the speech that everybody's nodding off to, the big guy doesn't get his own sort of fantasy sequence. And like, yeah, how would you put the big guy into like a fantasy sequence in this episode? If it was somebody else giving the speech, for instance.
Yeah, what does the big guy... I mean, we know that he daydreams and all the time, right?
Yes,
so
it's very Walter Mitty-like,
Right, so what does he daydream about? The first thing that flashed through my mind, to make another plug for our end of season 1 wrap-up episode, was my idea for a spin-off set in Arthur's Navy days.
Oh yeah.
But I actually think that most of these dreams are not flashbacks. So
right.
He plays with toy soldiers. Would he imagine himself as a general? Would he be Patton, or maybe not Patton, but like?
I mean, the other thing is we could go wildly on the other axis, which is we take the Robert Plant thing and we turn it into like he's the actual, like, he's the Fisher King, or he's King Arthur, and he's like going out there leading his troops to victory. Like I could see him really digging not a modern military fantasy, but something like that, where he's like a blue-daubed Celtic warrior of some kind,
or Arthurian, like you say, chivalry and daring do. That would probably play with Arthur.
When you think about the things the big guy wants, they all have to do with stability and not dealing with. Remember when he wanted to build the new station after the good book that they got, and he wanted to have his own little think tank? I almost think that the big guy's fantasy sequence would be like him in a nicely lined study with like a mug of hot chocolate or something like that. Something really mundane, like,
yeah.
Like it would only work in the context of an episode like this where everybody's having all these wild fantasies. Like his is literally just like, just him imagining himself completely insulated and isolated from everybody trying to distract him.
Yeah, like this is a nerdy reference, but in Harry Potter, there's the mirror that shows everyone their heart's desire.
Yeah.
And Dumbledore looks into it and sees warm socks.
Oh, that's right. That's perfect. He's so Dumbledore too. Oh my God, that's like
yeah. He's like so right. That's all he wants is just the Coco, and maybe Carmen's there, and nobody else is going to bother him.
Hey, thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back again soon with more WKRP riffs and memories. If you like this enough to listen to the whole thing, tell somebody about it.
You can find us on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Facebook and Twitter, and at holdmyorderterribledresser.com, which wasn't taken. We always appreciate your clicks, your stars, your reviews, your comments, your tweets, your emails. Don't be strangers.
Good day, and may the good news be yours.
Baby, if you've ever wondered
Wondered whatever became of me. I'm living on the air in Cincinnati. Cincinnati, WKRP. I'm at WKRP in Cincinnati.